World Solution Writing Process, Episode 17. The Parallel Government Obsession. A Lovecraftian horror comedy, short story, about a contagious political theory that takes over the life of anyone who encounters it. A story for our times. It was the early 2020s, and John Smith was plagued by a horrible boredom. His life had collapsed into what he called his Johnny Mnemonic weed loop. He watched Johnny Mnemonic over and over again, but smoked weed every time he watched it, so that he wouldn't remember all the details. So every time he watched it, there was some new surprise in the film. But he had looped through his loop too many times. Now the movie was getting more and more familiar. It was fun the first few times because the movie did move pretty quickly in its hard-boiled deadpan tone, more events than explanation, so there was always some new detail to pick up. Not anymore. John had already gone back and watched all the old-school science fiction movies that had led to Johnny Mnemonic, like Nemesis. How had he ended up this way? John used to be a protester, but that had gone completely sideways. With all the movement's factions, splits, conflicts, and histrionic personalities, John didn't even want to go to another march. Really, John wanted to riot. But being in a few proper riots, every march felt like the kiddie version. But after too many injuries and legal trouble, it was no longer practical. Even worse, he increasingly felt that all these marches were no longer effective, and that something more radical was necessary. He began studying historic waves of revolution which spread contagiously from country to country across various regions, like the Arab Spring and European movement of squares, the color revolutions of 1989 and the 2000s, waves like 1968, 1848, and the revolutions of 1917 to 1923. It didn't help that our poor protagonist was afflicted by shooting pains in his back that flared up whenever anyone said a bad or wrong opinion, as well as incurable acne, which made him the first person to be scapegoated in any activist coalition, and the scapegoating was continuous because something was always wrong, or his random attacks of diarrhea, as well as the continuous panic attacks he suffered as a result of all the other factors. Even worse, he had been a former Bernie Sanders supporter. Truly, in both his back and in his bowels, John Smith would continually #FuelTheBurn. John Smith was disillusioned with all the other European electoral experiments as well, like Syriza in Greece and Jeremy Corbyn in Britain. He had lived various places before his abode of a trailer in a mobile home park. He repressed the memory of his past residences with weed, because they were all bad experiences, and even thinking of them flared up his back pain. Still, John Smith couldn't forget the energy of the riots, the feeling of radicalism, the feeling of directly fighting the state with your own body, even if by now he was completely jaded about the political efficacy or usefulness of such a thing, at both a personal and theoretical level. He sought that same thrill elsewhere. Smith had gone down all the toxic rabbit holes. He had plunged into the Situationists, punk rock, Trotskyism, guerrilla warfare and political terrorism, Vice News, anarchist manuals for street insurrection as well as coup d'etat manuals, accelerationist manifestos of both fascists and anti-capitalists, Russian nihilism, 9/11 truth, various online horror web series, and all the pictures and videos of icebergs symbolizing various rabbit holes on various topics. He had all but given up on life and started playing Dungeons and Dragons by himself. But the first thing that happened when he actually tried it was his character's ass got kicked by goblins when they rolled a natural 20, and it completely threw off the rhythm of how the pre-written adventure was supposed to go. Anything that seemed like an Uzumaki-style spiral obsession of political polarization that your therapist would tell you to stay away from, he had already plunged into. At this point, he felt like he had read the entire internet, or at least the important parts. There was nothing more to cover. Had John gotten to the bottom of the rabbit hole of life? He felt like he had to be close. John played video games and smoked weed for his chronic pain. Sometimes he wondered if there was some possibility that this would eventually make him go crazy and make him forget the boundary between the game and reality. Instead, the aching truth was that this literally never occurred, and sometimes John wished that it would. There was no game immersive enough to completely distract him from his chronic pain and his depressing political boredom. It's not like John didn't love his video games. By this point, however, even they felt exhausted. Even music was boring. Just one more sequential arrangement of vibrations. Music was supposed to change the world, and it didn't. From the hippies of the 60s to the punks of the 80s. It still hadn't. Nothing flowed. He watched documentaries about the left-wing terrorists of the 1970s and found himself unable to finish them because he couldn't pay attention to them, his attention drifting, his brain going on strike. He watched riot footage and fell asleep in the middle of it. Everything was just one more failed political strategy. Most podcasts were so boring that John turned most of them off. He would listen to one or two of the more activist-oriented ones, not because he thought it made a difference, but partially out of some passive morbid curiosity, partially just to know what was going on in the scene in case some part of him ever decided to actually do something again, which felt increasingly unlikely. The supposedly funny podcasts were in fact not funny, because nothing was funny, because everything was a drag. John was way too radical to become a normie and go back to some kind of ordinary life. He knew that capitalism ruined everything, that capitalism was the desert of the real, that life under the system was a dissatisfying void. He was too radical to enjoy the little things, but too conscious of the movement's futile strategies to be politically active. He was trapped in a vacuous limbo of knowing that politics was the solution, but that also politics was completely dysfunctional, too radical for either activism or a political existence. John was on his weed-fueled cycle of dredging through various podcasts and YouTube channels to see if he would find something, anything, that would make him feel even slightly alive. He watched everything he could stomach on channels like State of the World, Popular Front, Auxiliary Statements, and the various more conventional socialist, anarchist, and communist channels, which all fell off into their various dogmatic biases, or careened into their pointless, endless commentary on social issues instead of providing strategies. Somehow, in this mixture, John Smith stumbled upon World Solution Writing Process. He had seen it appear in his also watched list on YouTube when watching other political podcast videos, with the captions on and the speed turned up to double, to burn through the otherwise unlistenable boredom. However, he ignored it because the viewership count was laughably low. One day Smith eventually took the plunge and clicked on a video. His ears were immediately assailed by bizarre fringe political theories and more historical facts and quotations than any sane person would ever want to absorb. However, one phrase kept reasserting itself throughout the entire podcast like an intrusive drumbeat. Parallel government. Parallel government? What the hell was that? It sounded like World Solution was trying to summon aliens from a parallel dimension. However, John Smith fell victim to the frequency illusion, also known appropriately as the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon after the German communist terrorist group, which has a tendency of worming its way into your head. Now that John noticed parallel government once, he noticed it everywhere. But was it really a frequency illusion? Or was this theory the secret center of all revolutionary history and political strategy? Could it really be? Trump's fake electors were a parallel government. The workers' councils of 1917 and 1968 were parallel governments. The Paris Commune, the American Continental Congress, these were parallel governments. Mao's revolutionary base areas in the guerrilla struggle were parallel governments, and arguably, so was the party-army assemblage, which the Chinese communists constructed during the Chinese Civil War, as well as the short-lived microstate of the Chinese Soviet Republic. ISIS was a parallel government. The Confederacy was an evil parallel government, and in many ways, so was Hitler's beer hall putsch. Even political parties within the system were sort of like parallel governments which agreed to play within the rules of the elections, with some parliamentary parties even referring to their administrations in waiting as shadow governments, prepared to step into power should that parliamentary party win an election and shift from opposition to majority. It seemed as though parallel government was the secret, unacknowledged heart of all human politics everywhere across all time. Even the Taliban had a parallel government in Afghanistan, and now another one in Pakistan. The puppet Donbass republics being used by Putin to invade Ukraine were also parallel governments. During the start of the Syrian civil war, there had been a total of 5 competing governments in Syria, and there were now 2 competing governments in both Libya and Burma. The one theorist which the podcast kept harping on over and over again was Gene Sharp, which seemed like a bad choice. Gene Sharp was a Western liberal with zero critique of capitalism at best, and a CIA-backed engineer of imperialist expansion at worst. Why did the podcast fixate so much on Sharp? It was because Sharp was the most recent theorist who had given a name to the phenomenon the entire podcast was centered around. In his 198 Tactics of Nonviolent Resistance, the final tactic explicitly listed was dual sovereignty or parallel government. The real psychological snap came when Smith started doing his own digging. Where had Gene Sharp gotten this idea? When John dug deeper into Gene Sharp's old writings, he found a reference to a historian of revolutions named Crane Brinton, whose work Anatomy of a Revolution was seen as a classic standard across history departments. But where had Brinton gotten this idea? Vladimir Lenin. Did Lenin really use this term? In at least two separate instances, he had, to describe the workers' councils of 1917. Could it really be possible that, after all the cyberpunk deep dives, after all the accelerationist rabbit holes, in the end it all circled back to John's own core politics of Leninism, which he had embraced in college and adhered to ever since, excepting a few brief lapses? Was this the Easter egg of history, hidden in plain sight, waiting for some eager adventurer to stumble upon it, take it, and lead the global masses in glorious revolution? Still, something felt off about this podcast. The way the concept wormed its way into his head gave him deja vu, like he had somehow already read everything the podcast was saying. Still, parallel government kept appearing everywhere, like a Doctor Who Time Lord appearing mysteriously at every point in history. So far, John Smith had been made to feel honestly stupid by World Solution writing process, but also a bit delighted. If anything, the podcast seemed entirely too hopeful in a world where doomer aesthetic was becoming the standard norm. The bottom fell out when the podcast started talking about role-playing games. John's early suspicion that the podcaster was trying to summon shadowy beings from parallel dimensions with the black magic of parallel government was now confirmed. The bizarreness of the concept was directly acknowledged on the podcast, which referred to the concept as a, quote, hyperstition, which becomes more real the more people believe in it. It became even stranger when the anonymous voice in the video started talking about laughtivism and surrealist protest art, to blur the line between fantasy and reality, to bring a new reality into being. The notion that if you don't like your government, you can and should start your own was acknowledged as the intrinsically comedic premise that it is. And yet this anonymous podcaster, this freak, this lonely pioneer of political theory, was prepared to gamble the fate of the entire global revolutionary movement, indeed the fate of the entire human species, and by extension possibly the fate of the entire multiverse, on this insipid data silliness. The stuttering and spitting voice of the podcast confirmed that to form a miniature legislature in opposition to your own government was practically indistinguishable from playing a role-playing game. You sat around a table, or a digital Zoom meeting or whatever, you proposed legislation, you deliberated and voted. At some point through street actions, the game would burst into reality. The author of the podcast even descended into considering the podcast itself a sort of role-playing game for themselves, an adventure they progressed through by making more episodes. Some premonition of doom fell across John Smith as he heard this process described. Somehow it reminded him of his own fateful attempt to play Dungeons & Dragons by himself. Of course by himself because everyone else gave him back pain with their dumb and bad opinions, but in which the entire process had been derailed by those goddamn goblins rolling a natural 20 when attacking his character. It was all too much. Too many different thoughts were competing in John Smith's poor, weed-muddled brain. History, politics, role-playing games, alternate dimensions, comedy, and a secret theory at the heart of all human existence, possibly at the heart of all reality? Was the concept of parallel government itself an interdimensional gateway? Was he starting to slip through it? When he got to the other side and encountered the eldritch horror interdimensional entities, would he finally encounter someone he could stand to talk to? John felt like he was going to pass out, or have a seizure or a stroke, or just die from mental overwhelm. He ripped his bong. This was all too much. He had to retreat to the safety of his entertainment loop. He put on Johnny Mnemonic. Then he immediately turned it off. The crisis was total. He had finally watched Johnny Mnemonic too many times. He turned on his first-person shooter games, his fantasy RPGs. He turned them off. He had already played them too many times as well. Those circuits in his brain were burned out into boredom by grueling repetition. He tried playing other, newer first-person shooters and fantasy RPGs, but it was all the same. Everything was the same. All the games felt the same. He couldn't play any games. Maybe he would try one more movie. He had never seen 8 Mile. He ripped his bong again and turned it on. Upon watching it, Smith had the sneaking suspicion the movie was about his own life, living in a trailer park full of noise and drama and stress and arguments. But he wasn't trying to be a rapper. Was he even trying to be anything? At the edge of consciousness, the breakthrough finally occurred. His entertainment loop was not his main mental loop. It was the secondary loop. After watching Johnny Mnemonic enough times, John remembered that the entire purpose of his habit loop of smoking weed, gaming, watching movies, and reading random political theory was only half the story. It was because his main brain circuits were far too burned out by his laborious, historic task that he so desperately sought to continually replenish his neurotransmitters, to do anything silly or fun or interesting or unserious, just to replenish his main brain circuits back to being able to work. This was the essential lesson of neural budgeting, of brain rationing, intrinsic in Johnny Mnemonic. He watched that movie not to forget, not to remember, but to forget and remember at the same time. John Smith was himself the podcaster behind World Solution Writing Process. The historic theories he was dealing with were so intrinsically central and heavy that the physical limitations of his brain could not contend with containing them, and he suffered frequent crashes, so he constantly forgot. He let himself forget, again and again and again. John Smith realized he had committed a monstrous mental compartmentalization, something to which we can all fall victim. But the true horror was realizing that the entire capitalist world functions on the vast majority of people making precisely the same sort of monstrous mental compartmentalization for far less brave and noble reasons. It was then that John Smith remembered that this virus inside him, this parallel government obsession, it had to spread. He could take a break from his entertainment loop. He could get back to work. He could make more episodes. He could keep playing Dungeons and Dragons. After all, he wasn't playing it for fun. He was playing it for revolutionary research, because parallel government is a role-playing game. And then he remembered what step he was at in the process of spreading this virus. Starting a parallel government immediately was too premature. First, he had to foster an intellectual scene. It begins with pure theory, then becomes a global insurrection. First, he had to organize Zoom meetings about the theory of parallel government. We're currently scheduling our first discussions. Would you like to join the discussion group?